A homeless veteran spent his last $5 on a broken diner everyone laughed at. But when a deadly blizzard hit the mountains, that forgotten building became the only place standing between an entire town and death. Ethan Walker had nothing left in the world except a worn-out backpack, a loyal German shepherd named Shadow, and the last $5 in his pocket. When he saw an abandoned roadside diner listed for $5, he made the most reckless decision of his life. What he didn't know was that beneath that diner lay a secret built decades earlier, and that one night, during the worst storm Pine Hollow had ever seen, the town would run to his door for survival. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from today? The truck stop sat alone beside a long stretch of highway in southern Wyoming. Now, the kind of place travelers barely noticed unless they were desperate for gas, coffee, or a few hours of sleep. The neon sign above the building flickered in the cold night air, buzzing like a tired insect. Beyond the parking lot stretched miles of dark prairie and distant hills, all of it swallowed by a sky heavy with winter clouds. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed quietly over rows of plastic chairs. Ethan Walker sat in the far corner near a vending machine that hadn't worked in years. His shoulders were hunched inside a faded army jacket that had seen too many winters. In his right hand, he held a crumpled $5 bill. He had been staring at it for nearly 10 minutes. The paper felt thin between his fingers, soft from age and handling. It was the last money he had, $5, not enough for a motel room. Not enough for a proper meal. Maybe enough for a stale sandwich from the gas station cooler down the road. Ethan turned the bill over slowly, as if another look might somehow change its value. It didn't. At his feet, a large German shepherd lifted his head. Shadow's ears twitched at the faint rumble of a diesel engine outside. The dog was big, his coat dark and thick, streaked with patches of silver along the muzzle that hinted at age and hard years. One ear bore a small notch from an old injury, and a faint scar ran along his front leg. Shadow watched Ethan with calm, intelligent eyes. Then he rested his head gently against Ethan's boot. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You're still here," he muttered. Shadow's tail gave a slow, quiet thump against the floor. Most people would have given up by now. Ethan knew that. But when he came home from Afghanistan 2 years earlier, the plan had been simple. Find a job, find a place to live, start over. But plans had a way of falling apart. The memories came first. Loud sounds made his heart race. Sudden movement made his hands shake. Some nights he woke up convinced he was back in the desert, hearing explosions that didn't exist. The doctors called it post-traumatic stress, PTSD, a tidy little phrase for something that felt like your mind was still trapped in a war long after the war had ended. Employers didn't understand it. Landlords didn't tolerate it. One job became 3, then 2, then none. The apartment went next. After that came weeks of sleeping wherever he could. A shelter in Cheyenne, a borrowed couch in Casper, and finally this truck stop, where nobody asked questions as long as you stayed quiet. Outside, a semi-truck roared past on the highway. The sudden sound made Ethan's body tighten instantly. For half a second, his mind was somewhere else. Dust, heat, the metallic crack of gunfire. A blinding flash. Ethan blinked hard and forced himself back to the present. Shadow nudged his leg again. "I'm good," Ethan said quietly, but his voice sounded thin. He rubbed a hand over his face and leaned back against the cold wall. Across the room, a television mounted near the ceiling played a muted news broadcast. The subtitles crawled along the bottom of the screen, while the anchor spoke silently about weather warnings somewhere in the Midwest. No one else seemed to be watching. A trucker slept with his hat pulled low over his eyes. Another man hunched over a laptop near the coffee machine. Otherwise, the room was empty. Ethan pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was cracked along one corner, but it still worked. Barely. The truck stop offered free Wi-Fi, though free mostly meant slow enough to make a person lose patience. Ethan opened a browser anyway. He had already checked job boards twice that night. Nothing nearby. Nothing he could get to without a car. Still, he kept scrolling. Habit, hope, maybe both. Shadow shifted slightly, resting his chin on Ethan's knee. The warmth helped. Ethan scrolled past ads for apartments he couldn't afford, used trucks that cost more than he had earned all year, farm jobs hours away. Then a county auction page appeared. He almost ignored it. Most government auctions usually meant seized cars or old office furniture, things nobody wanted anymore. But one listing caught his eye. The picture loaded slowly. It showed a small roadside building sitting alone beside a 2-lane road. A diner, the kind built decades ago with wide windows and a flat roof trimmed in chrome. The paint was faded and weeds had taken over the parking lot. Above the entrance hung a crooked sign. Iron Mesa Diner. Ethan leaned closer to the screen. He read the description beneath the photo. Abandoned roadside diner, Pine Hollow County, Montana. Starting bid, $5 sold as is. Buyer must claim keys in person. Ethan blinked. Then he read it again. $5. The same amount he was holding in his hand. That can't be right, he murmured. Shadow lifted his head slightly, as if reacting to the change in Ethan's voice. Ethan tapped the screen and opened the listing. The details were short. Former diner. Closed 20 years. Property maintained by county for tax purposes. Structure, condition unknown. Starting bid, $5. No inspection available. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Montana. He had never even been there. The distance alone made the idea ridiculous. He glanced down at the $5 bill again. $5 couldn't buy a future, but it could buy a chance. The thought crept into his mind slowly. Then it stayed. "What do you think?" he said quietly. Shadow tilted his head. Ethan gave a dry laugh. "Yeah, I know." It sounded insane. A diner nobody wanted. In a town he'd never seen, 2,000 miles away. But then again, what exactly was keeping him here? A broken chair and a truck stop. A phone with no service contract. $5. Shadow shifted closer, pressing his side against Ethan's leg. The dog's presence was steady, grounding. Ethan looked at the listing one more time. His thumb hovered over the bid button. If someone else had already placed an offer, the price would climb. The idea would end there. But the current bid still read $5. No other offers. Ethan felt something strange stir in his chest. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile. This was something quieter, a stubborn refusal to disappear. He looked down at Shadow. "You pulled me out of a blast once," Ethan said softly. The memory flashed through his mind. A patrol route, a buried explosive, the deafening crack that turned the world white. When Ethan woke up in the dust and smoke, Shadow had been dragging him by the vest away from the wreckage. The dog had refused to leave him. Ethan reached down and scratched the thick fur behind Shadow's ear. "Well," he said slowly, "maybe this is our next bad idea." Shadow's tail thumped once. Ethan stared at the screen. Then he pressed the button. The page refreshed. Bid accepted. For a moment he simply sat there. Nothing changed. The room still smelled faintly of burnt coffee. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead. Outside, another truck rolled through the night. But somewhere in Montana, an abandoned diner now had an owner. Ethan Walker. And his dog. Ethan looked down at the $5 bill in his hand. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to a smile. "Guess we're heading north," he said. Shadow stood up, ears alert, on as if he had been waiting to hear those words. Ethan folded the empty bill and slipped it back into his pocket. Outside the window, the highway stretched into the darkness. A long road. But for the first time in months, it felt like it might lead somewhere. Ethan Walker stood outside the truck stop just before sunrise, the cold Wyoming air biting through the thin fabric of his jacket. The horizon was turning pale gray, the first hint of morning stretching across the endless prairie. Trucks rumbled past on the highway, their headlights cutting through the dim light like silent comets. Shadow stood beside him, alert and calm. The dog's breath rose in faint clouds. Ethan checked his phone again. The confirmation email was still there. County auction notice. Winning bid, $5. Property, Iron Mesa Diner. Location, Pine Hollow County. As Montana buyer must claim keys within 14 days. 14 days. Ethan let out a quiet breath. Guess that makes it official, he said. Shadow flicked his ears. Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked north, though he couldn't see Montana from here. Just miles of highway and frozen land. He had no car, no savings, and now he apparently owned a diner 2,000 miles away. He almost laughed. Only thing crazier would have been if someone else bid $6, he muttered. Shadow nudged his hand again. The dog had a way of doing that whenever Ethan started drifting too far into his thoughts. Yeah, Ethan said softly. We should probably figure out how to get there. Inside the truck stop, the coffee machine finally sputtered to life as a clerk unlocked the counter. Ethan stepped back in, warming his hands near the heater vent. The smell of burnt coffee and frying eggs filled the small building. The same trucker who had been sleeping earlier was now finishing breakfast. Another pair of drivers walked in, stamping snow off their boots. Normal morning routines. For a moment, Ethan felt like a ghost moving through someone else's life. Then Shadow sat beside him, tall and steady. A reminder he wasn't alone. Ethan approached the counter and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a plain coffee. The waitress glanced at Shadow. Dog allowed in here? He's service-trained, Ethan said. That was technically true. Shadow had been trained by the military years ago. The woman shrugged. Well, he's quieter than most folks that come through. Ethan gave a faint smile. He sat near the window, sipping coffee slowly. His mind worked through the problem. Montana. No car. 2,000 miles. Then he noticed a pair of truckers talking near the door. One of them mentioned Billings. Montana. Ethan stood up. Excuse me, he said. The older trucker looked him over. You headed somewhere? Montana, Ethan said. Any chance you're going that direction? The man scratched his beard. Close enough. I'm hauling up through Casper and then west. Ethan nodded. I can ride quiet. The driver studied him for a long moment. Then he looked down at Shadow. That dog behave? Shadow sat perfectly still. The trucker grinned. He's better behaved than my brother. Ethan exhaled slowly. Appreciate it. An hour later, they were rolling north on Interstate 25. The cab of the semi-truck smelled like diesel and peppermint gum. Where country music played softly from the radio. Shadow lay between the seats, watching the road through the windshield. Outside, Wyoming unfolded in long stretches of pale grass and distant mountains. For a while, Ethan simply watched the road. The movement felt strange after weeks of standing still. Miles passed beneath the wheels. The sky brightened. Then a metal chain clanged somewhere in the trailer behind them. The sharp sound snapped through Ethan's mind like a rifle shot. His body reacted instantly. His hands tightened. His breath shortened. Dust. Gunfire. Shouting. For a moment the cab disappeared and the desert returned. Ethan's vision blurred. A heavy weight pressed against his leg. Shadow. The dog had already moved, pressing his body firmly against Ethan's side. Warm, solid, real. Ethan closed his eyes and breathed slowly. The trucker glanced over. "You all right?" "Yeah," Ethan said after a moment. The driver nodded like he understood more than he said. "My brother came back from Iraq like that," he muttered. They drove the rest of the morning mostly in silence. By afternoon, the land began to change. Mountains appeared along the horizon. Tall pines replaced open prairie. The air grew colder. By the time they reached Casper, snow had begun to fall lightly. Ethan climbed down from the truck, stretching stiff legs. "Thanks for the ride," he said. "No problem." The driver looked at him once more. "You got somewhere to be?" Ethan thought about the diner, about the $5 bid, about a place he had never seen. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I do." Another truck heading toward Montana picked them up outside a gas station that evening. Then another the next morning. Piece by piece, mile by mile, the road carried them west. The Rockies rose higher each hour. Snow covered the slopes. Dark forests filled the valleys. Shadow seemed to grow more alert the deeper they went into the mountains, watching every passing ridge like he recognized something in the land. By the end of the second day, Ethan finally saw the road sign. "Welcome to Pine Hollow County. Population 912. The truck dropped them near a small gas station at the edge of town. Pine Hollow looked exactly like the kind of place highways forgot. A single main street, a few old brick buildings, a feed store, a mechanic shop. Snow piled along the sidewalks. People moved slowly here, like time had less urgency. Ethan slung his backpack over his shoulder. Shadow walked beside him, tail low but steady. He pulled his phone out again and opened the auction listing. The address led out of town along an older highway road. 2 miles later, the trees opened into a wide clearing, and there it was. Iron Mesa Diner. The building stood alone beside the road, surrounded by a cracked parking lot where weeds poked through frozen asphalt. The chrome trim along the roof had dulled with age, and the once bright neon sign hung crooked over the entrance. Iron Mesa Diner. The letters were faded but still readable. Snow rested along the edges of the roof. For a long moment, Ethan simply stood there. After everything, the truck stop, the ride north, the endless miles, this place was real. Shadow stepped forward first. Well, the dog sniffed the air carefully. Then he looked back at Ethan, as if to say, "Well?" Ethan walked toward the door. The key envelope from the county office felt heavy in his pocket. He slid the brass key into the lock. It stuck for a moment, then turned. The door creaked open slowly. Cold air drifted out. Dust floated through beams of gray daylight from the windows. Inside sat rows of red booths, a long counter, and metal stools that hadn't been touched in years. The entire diner looked frozen in time. Ethan stepped inside. Shadow followed close behind. Neither of them knew yet that beneath their feet, hidden under the kitchen floor, waited something that would change everything. The door of the diner creaked shut behind them with a hollow echo. For a moment, the building was completely silent. A dust hung in the air, like thin gray fog, drifting slowly through beams of pale afternoon light that slipped through the wide front windows. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the walls, carrying the distant whisper of pine trees from the mountains. Ethan Walker stood just inside the entrance, letting his eyes adjust. The place smelled old, not rotten, just forgotten. He stepped forward slowly. His boots left faint marks in the thin layer of dust covering the black and white tile floor. The pattern of the tiles was worn but still visible, like the bones of something that had once been alive. Rows of red vinyl booths lined the windows. Some of them had cracked seams where the stuffing inside had pushed through. A long counter ran along the right wall, set with a row of chrome stools still standing exactly where customers had left them decades earlier. The diner looked less abandoned than paused, like everyone had simply walked out one day and never returned. Shadow padded forward quietly, nails clicking softly against the tile. The dog's nose moved constantly, taking in every scent. Old grease, metal, dust, something faint beneath it all. Ethan walked toward the counter. A faded menu board still hung above the kitchen pass-through. Burgers, $2.10. Coffee, 50 cents, cherry pie, $1.25. Ethan gave a faint smile. Guess inflation hadn't caught up yet. Shadow wagged his tail once. Ethan rested his hands on the counter and looked out through the front windows. The view surprised him. But the diner sat along an old stretch of highway that curved gently through a valley surrounded by pine-covered hills. Snow rested along the roadside, and the distant Rocky Mountains rose like silent giants beyond the tree line. It was quiet. Really quiet. Not the empty quiet of a city alley at night. This was the deep quiet of open land, where the wind and trees were the only things speaking. For someone like Ethan, who had spent years surrounded by the noise of war and highways and crowded shelters, the silence felt almost unreal. He turned back toward the kitchen. Let's see what we bought for $5. The swinging door into the kitchen groaned when he pushed it open. The room beyond was smaller than he expected. A long stainless steel prep table sat in the center. Rust-speckled refrigerators lined the back wall, and a large industrial stove stood beneath a vent hood that had collected decades of dust. Old coffee mugs still hung from hooks near the sink. Shadow walked ahead, sniffing every corner. Ethan moved slowly through the room, opening cabinets and checking drawers. Utensils, pots, boxes of yellowed napkins. Everything looked like it had been left exactly where it was. He opened the refrigerator. Empty. The freezer. Empty. The pantry shelves held only a few forgotten cans whose labels had faded beyond recognition. Nothing exciting yet, Ethan murmured. Shadow suddenly stopped. The dog's ears lifted sharply. Then came the sound. Scratch. 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 Shadow began pawing at the floor near the back wall. Ethan turned. What is it? Shadow barked once, short and sharp. Then he scratched again at the tile. Ethan walked over. The spot Shadow had chosen looked no different from the rest of the floor at first glance. But when Ethan crouched down, he noticed something strange. A faint outline in the tile. A square shape. He brushed some dust away with his sleeve. Metal. A thin seam ran around the edge. Ethan frowned. Hold on. He grabbed a nearby wrench from the prep table and slid the tip carefully under the edge. The metal plate shifted slightly with a dull clunk. Shadow barked again. Easy, Ethan said. He wedged the wrench deeper and pulled. The plate lifted. Beneath it sat a heavy steel hatch with a recessed handle. Ethan stared at it. What in the world? The hatch looked thick. Military thick. Like something built to survive more than just time. A strange feeling crept up Ethan's spine. Shadow stepped closer, his nose almost touching the metal. The dog whined softly. Ethan gripped the handle. The metal was cold. For a moment he hesitated. He had opened enough doors in his life that led to things better left alone. But curiosity pushed him forward. He pulled. The hatch lifted slowly with a long groan of hinges that hadn't moved in decades. A dark stairwell appeared beneath it. Cold air rose from below, carrying a faint smell of metal and something else. Storage. Ethan grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. Concrete steps led downward. The walls were reinforced with steel panels. This wasn't a simple basement. This was something else. Shadow stepped forward without hesitation. "Hey," Ethan said, but the dog was already descending the stairs. Ethan sighed. "Oh, guess we're doing this." He followed. The stairwell turned once, then opened into a wide underground room. Ethan stopped at the bottom. The light from his phone swept slowly across the space. Rows of shelves, boxes stacked neatly, metal cabinets, water containers, medical kits. The room was enormous. A bunker. Not just a storm shelter. A fully stocked survival bunker. Ethan's breath caught. "What?" Shadow moved deeper into the room, sniffing quickly between the shelves. Ethan walked forward slowly, shining the flashlight across the supplies. Canned food, emergency rations, blankets, fuel containers. Even a large generator mounted near the far wall. Everything was carefully organized, as if someone had prepared this place for a very long wait. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "This is insane." He moved toward a metal desk in the corner. A thick notebook rested on top. Its leather cover had aged, but remained intact. Ethan opened it. The first page held a name written in neat, steady handwriting. Samuel Whitaker, former Colonel, United States Marine Corps. Ethan froze. The name felt familiar. He flipped through a few pages. The notebook was a journal. Entries dated back nearly 30 years. Most described the construction of the bunker. Supplies, maintenance, plans. But one line near the top caught Ethan's eye. "If you are reading this, it means the diner has found a new guardian." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Shadow suddenly barked again from the far side of the bunker. The dog stood near a wooden crate. His nose pressed against something inside. Ethan walked over and opened it, and inside lay a small metal box. Military issue. Ethan lifted the lid. His breath caught. Inside were several medals and a worn military patch, a unit insignia. One Ethan recognized instantly. It belonged to the very regiment Ethan had served in during Afghanistan. He stared at it, stunned. How is that even possible? Shadow sat beside him quietly. The bunker felt different now. Not just hidden, connected. As if the place had been waiting for someone like him. Ethan closed the metal box slowly. Above them, the diner creaked softly in the mountain wind. And somewhere deep in the silent valley of Pine Hollow, the story of Iron Mesa Diner had just begun to wake up. Ethan Walker stood in the middle of the bunker for a long time, the metal box still resting in his hands. But the beam from his phone's flashlight drifted slowly across the room again. Rows of supplies. Shelves stacked with canned food. Medical kits sealed in plastic. Fuel containers labeled with dates that stretched back decades. Someone had built this place with purpose. Not panic. Preparation. Shadow moved quietly between the shelves, his nose brushing along the edges of boxes, as if he were inspecting the bunker like a soldier checking equipment. Ethan looked back down at the patch inside the metal box. It carried the insignia of the 3rd Battalion unit he had served with years earlier. He hadn't seen that symbol since Afghanistan. A strange weight settled in his chest. "What were you building down here, Colonel?" he murmured. The journal on the desk suddenly felt more important. As Ethan walked back to it and flipped through several pages, the handwriting was steady and disciplined, military neat. Entry after entry described supplies being added to the bunker, fuel reserves, water purification systems, medical inventory. But every few pages, the journal drifted into something more personal. Whitaker wrote about the town, about Pine Hollow, about people who might one day need shelter when the world outside failed them. One line caught Ethan's eye. A soldier prepares not for the war he wants, but the one that comes. Ethan closed the journal slowly. "Guess you believed something bad was coming," he said quietly. Shadow trotted back toward the stairs and looked up. The dog gave a soft bark. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Let's see the rest of the place." They climbed back into the diner, when the afternoon light had shifted while they were underground. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, turning the sky pale gold. Dust floated through the quiet dining room. For the first time since arriving, Ethan walked through the diner with different eyes. This wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a place someone had protected, prepared, preserved. He stepped behind the counter and wiped his hand across the old surface. The dust smeared into a clean streak. "Could probably still serve coffee here," he muttered. Shadow hopped onto a booth seat and watched him. Ethan wandered through the diner slowly. Behind the kitchen, he found a small office. A rusted desk sat near the window. Inside the drawers were old receipts, faded photographs, and a yellowing newspaper clipping taped to the wall. Iron Mesa Diner celebrates 20 years. The photo showed a much younger Samuel Whitaker standing proudly outside the building. Beside him stood several townspeople, children, families, workers. The diner had once been the heart of this place. Ethan stared at the photo for a moment. Then he folded the clipping and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. The mountains had turned purple in the fading light. Shadow suddenly jumped down from the booth and moved toward the door. His ears stood alert. Then came the sound. A car engine. Ethan froze. The vehicle slowed as it approached the diner. Tires crunched against the cracked pavement of the old parking lot. Ethan stepped outside. A black SUV rolled to a stop near the front entrance. The engine shut off. For a moment, nothing moved. But then the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. She looked to be in her early 30s, dressed in a dark winter coat that probably cost more than everything Ethan owned. Her boots crunched on the snow as she walked toward him. Her posture carried confidence, control, the kind of person used to being listened to. Shadow moved beside Ethan instantly. The dog's body stiffened slightly. The woman stopped a few steps away. Her eyes moved over Ethan quickly. His worn jacket, his backpack, then Shadow. "You must be Ethan Walker," she said. Her voice was calm but cold. Ethan nodded slowly. "That depends," he replied. "Who's asking?" The woman reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. She held it up. "Victoria Whitaker." The name landed heavily. Ethan recognized it immediately. Whitaker. Saw the same name from the bunker. "My grandfather owned this diner," she continued. Ethan crossed his arms slightly. "Owned?" Victoria gave a thin smile. "Yes. Owned." She stepped closer and handed him the paper. Legal documents. Property records. Ethan scanned the page. "I bought the place through the county auction," he said. Victoria nodded. "Yes, you did." Her smile faded. "But that auction was filed under abandoned property. My family is currently disputing that classification." Ethan felt the calm he'd found earlier begin to tighten. "So what are you saying?" Victoria looked around the diner slowly. Her expression carried faint disappointment. "As much as I appreciate your enthusiasm," she said, "this property is still legally tied to my grandfather's estate." She looked back at Ethan. "My attorneys are preparing the paperwork now." Ethan folded the document carefully. "And you'll need to leave." The words landed like a cold wind. Shadow growled softly. Victoria glanced at the dog but didn't step back. "I'm planning to sell the land," she continued. "There's a renewable energy company interested in building a solar field here. The offer is $600,000. Ethan stared at her. $600,000. For a moment, the number didn't even feel real. "This diner is falling apart," Victoria added. "No one has used it in 20 years. She looked directly at him. "Honestly, I'm surprised someone even bothered bidding on it." Ethan felt something shift inside him. Anger. Not the explosive anger he remembered from the war. Something slower, heavier. You said you're disputing the auction," he said. Victoria nodded. "Yes. And until that's settled, you have 30 days. The wind rustled the trees along the road. 30 days. Ethan looked back at the diner, at the cracked windows, the faded sign, the quiet building that had already started to feel like something more than just a structure. Then he thought about the bunker, about Samuel Whitaker, about the journal. Victoria turned to leave. 30 days, Mr. Walker," she said calmly. "After that, this place goes back to my family." She paused beside the SUV. "And I strongly recommend you don't invest any effort fixing it." She opened the door. "It won't be yours for long." The engine started. The SUV backed out slowly onto the road. Then it disappeared down the valley. The silence returned. Ethan stood there for a long time. Shadow sat beside him, watching the empty road. 30 days. Ethan turned slowly toward the diner. Behind the quiet walls of the building, beneath the kitchen floor, the bunker remained hidden, prepared, waiting. Shadow looked up at him. Ethan scratched the dog behind the ear. "Well," he said quietly, "guess we just got ourselves a fight." The wind rolled gently down from the mountains, brushing through the tall pines beyond the road. Snow shifted across the cracked parking lot in thin, drifting lines. Ethan Walker stood outside Iron Mesa Diner for another moment, watching the empty highway where the black SUV had disappeared. 30 days. That was the clock now. 30 days before lawyers and paperwork could erase the only thing that had felt remotely like a second chance. Shadow sat beside him, eyes still fixed down the road. The dog's ears twitched slightly as the wind changed direction. Ethan let out a slow breath. "Well," he muttered again, softer this time, "standing here won't fix anything." He turned back toward the diner. The building looked different now, not abandoned, threatened. Inside, the quiet returned as soon as the door closed behind them. Dust still hung in the air, but Ethan began to notice details he hadn't before. The layout of the room, the solid structure of the counter, the wide windows that looked out across the valley. Under the dust and neglect, the diner had good bones. Shadow padded through the room again, sniffing corners like a patrol dog checking a perimeter. Ethan walked behind the counter and grabbed an old rag from beneath the sink, and he wiped a section of the countertop clean. Then another. Then another. The red vinyl of the nearest booth slowly emerged from beneath the gray film of time. "Let's see if the town remembers this place," he said quietly. An hour later, Ethan and Shadow were walking down Pine Hollow's main street. The town was small enough that the entire downtown area fit within 3 blocks. A grocery store, a mechanic garage, a feed supply shop, and a small diner that appeared to be the only place currently serving food. The sign outside read, "Alvarez Market and Cafe." Inside, the warm smell of soup and fresh bread wrapped around them the moment they stepped through the door. The room quieted slightly as several customers glanced up. Small towns noticed strangers. A woman behind the counter wiped her hands on an apron and smiled. Well, she looked to be in her late 50s, with silver streaks in her dark hair and kind, watchful eyes. "Well now," she said, "that's a fine dog." Shadow sat automatically beside Ethan. "He behaves better than I do," Ethan said. The woman laughed softly. "I'm Maria Alvarez. What can I get you?" "Just coffee," Ethan said. Maria poured a mug and slid it across the counter. "Passing through Pine Hollow?" Ethan hesitated. "Actually, I just bought the Iron Mesa diner. The spoon in Maria's hand stopped moving. You bought it? Ethan nodded. County auction. Maria leaned back slightly. Well, I'll be. Two older men at a nearby table exchanged glances. One of them stood up slowly and walked over. He wore oil-stained coveralls and smelled faintly of engine grease. You the fella that bought Whitaker's diner? He asked. Oh, that's right. The man studied Ethan carefully, then extended a hand. Frank Dalton. Ethan shook it. Ethan Walker. Frank glanced down at Shadow. Good-looking shepherd. His name's Shadow. Frank nodded approvingly. Colonel Whitaker loved dogs, he said. Ethan's attention sharpened. You knew him? Everyone in Pine Hollow knew Sam Whitaker, Frank replied. He pulled a chair over and sat. That diner used to be the center of this town. Maria leaned on the counter. Truckers stopped there every morning, she said. Kids after school. Half the town had breakfast there. Frank nodded slowly. Sam built the place in the late 70s after he retired from the Marines. Ethan remembered the journal. Why'd it close? Frank's expression shifted slightly. Sam got older. Town got quieter. As highway traffic moved to the new interstate. He shrugged. Eventually, he just locked the doors. Maria added gently, but he never sold it. Ethan sipped his coffee. His granddaughter says she's taking it back. Frank's eyebrows lifted. Victoria? That's the one. Frank gave a low whistle. Well, that'll be interesting. Maria frowned slightly. She came through here last year talking about selling the land. Solar company, Ethan said. Frank shook his head slowly. Sam would hate that. Why? Ethan asked. Frank leaned forward. Because Sam always said that diner had another purpose. Ethan felt the memory of the bunker beneath his feet. What purpose? Frank tapped the counter. He never told anyone exactly. But he used to say something strange. Maria smiled faintly. He said one day the diner might save lives. Ethan sat quietly. Shadow rested his chin on Ethan's knee. Frank noticed. Your dog trained? Military, Ethan said. Frank nodded slowly. So were you. It wasn't a question. Ethan didn't answer. Frank didn't press. Instead, he stood and grabbed his coat. Well, he said, if you're planning to fix that place up, you'll probably need tools. Ethan looked up. You offering? Frank grinned. I run the only mechanic shop in Pine Hollow. I've got enough spare equipment to rebuild a small town. Maria laughed. And if he doesn't scare you away, I'll send some food over. Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Support. Frank glanced toward the door. Sheriff Reed usually drives by around sunset. I'll tell him the diner's got a new owner. Sheriff? Ethan asked. Frank shrugged. Oh, a town this small, the sheriff's basically the welcome committee. Outside, the evening light was already fading when Ethan and Shadow walked back toward the diner. The mountains were turning dark blue against the sky. Smoke drifted from chimneys across town. Shadow trotted ahead for a moment, then turned back toward Ethan. For the first time since arriving, the valley didn't feel empty. It felt connected. Behind them, Pine Hollow's few lights began to glow. Ahead of them, Iron Mesa Diner waited quietly in the fading light. And beneath its floor, the bunker remained stocked and silent, prepared for a day when the town might need it again. Night settled slowly over the valley of Pine Hollow. The mountains darkened first, and their tall ridges turning into black silhouettes against a sky that glowed faintly with the last light of sunset. Cold air rolled down through the pine forests, carrying the quiet sound of wind through branches. Inside Iron Mesa Diner, Ethan Walker pushed open the front door and stepped back into the dusty silence. Shadow followed, tail low but steady. For a moment, Ethan just stood there. The diner felt less empty now, not alive yet, but awake. He set his backpack down near the counter and rubbed his hands together. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what we can do with this place." Shadow trotted toward the kitchen, already sniffing the floor like he had earlier. Ethan grabbed the same rag he'd used that afternoon and started cleaning again. Dust came off the counter in thick gray streaks, while each pass of the rag revealed more of the diner's old shine. The chrome edge of the counter slowly reappeared. The red vinyl booths began to look almost respectable again. Ethan worked steadily, cleaning, moving chairs, opening windows to let the stale air escape. Outside, the sky darkened completely. By the time he finished wiping the last table, the only light in the diner came from the flashlight on his phone. Shadow returned from the kitchen and sat beside him. Ethan scratched the dog's neck. "You know," he murmured, "this place might actually work." Shadow thumped his tail once. Ethan walked to the front window and looked out across the valley. The highway stretched quietly through the trees. No traffic, no headlights, just silence and snow. A faint glow of lights from Pine Hollow flickered in the distance. For the first time since the war, Ethan didn't feel like he was passing through somewhere. He felt like he had arrived. But that thought didn't last long. Headlights appeared on the road. A truck approached slowly, its tires crunching through the snow-covered asphalt of the diner parking lot. The vehicle stopped. A moment later, the driver stepped out. A tall man wearing a heavy sheriff's coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Shadow stood immediately. Ethan stepped outside. The sheriff walked toward him calmly, hands resting near his belt. "You Ethan Walker?" he asked. "That's me." The sheriff nodded once. "Mason Reed." They shook hands. His grip was firm but not aggressive. "Frank Dalton told me you were in town," Reed said. "News travels fast around here." Ethan glanced at the quiet valley. I'm starting to notice that." Sheriff Reed looked at the diner thoughtfully. "Haven't seen lights on in this place for 20 years. "I'm working on that," Ethan replied. Reed nodded slowly. Then his expression shifted slightly. "Victoria Whitaker already called my office." Ethan wasn't surprised. "Let me guess," he said. "She wants me gone." Reed gave a small shrug. "She wants the property secured until the legal dispute is settled." "And you?" "I enforce the law," Reed replied calmly. He looked Ethan directly in the eyes. "But the auction paperwork checks out, for now." Ethan let out a quiet breath. "So I can stay?" "For the moment." The sheriff studied the building again. "Sam Whitaker was a friend of mine," he added. Ethan noticed the change in his tone. You knew about the diner?" "Everyone did." "Did you know about the bunker?" Reed's eyebrows lifted. "Bunker?" Ethan hesitated. Then he nodded toward the kitchen. "You might want to see something." A few minutes later, they stood in the underground room beneath the diner. Sheriff Reed walked slowly between the shelves, his flashlight sweeping across the stacked supplies. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. He examined the generator, the water tanks, the rows of sealed ration boxes. This place could keep half the town alive for weeks. Ethan nodded. "That's what it looks like." Reed shook his head slowly. "Sam never told anyone the bunker was finished." Shadow padded quietly through the room, checking every corner again. The sheriff crouched beside the journal on the desk. He read a few lines silently, and then closed it carefully. "That stubborn old Marine," he said softly. They climbed back upstairs. Outside, the wind had grown stronger. The temperature had dropped sharply. Reed pulled his coat tighter. "You checked the weather lately?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. "No signal most of the time." The sheriff pointed toward the mountains. "Storm coming." "How bad?" Reed looked at the dark horizon. "Worst one they've predicted in years." The wind gusted harder across the valley. Snow began to fall again, light at first, then heavier. If the forecast is right, Reed continued, we're talking about temperatures dropping below -35 . Ethan looked back toward the diner, then toward the bunker beneath it. Reed noticed. That bunker down there, the sheriff said, could save a lot of people. Ethan thought about Whitaker's journal, about the line Frank had repeated earlier. The diner might save lives. Shadow stood beside him, ears tilted toward the rising wind. Reed stepped toward his truck. You planning to stay here tonight? Ethan nodded. Yeah. The sheriff opened his door. Well, he said, looks like the diner might get its first customers sooner than you expected. Snow began to swirl across the parking lot as the truck pulled away. The wind howled softly through the pines. Inside the diner, Ethan closed the door and looked around the quiet room. The storm was coming, and beneath his feet waited a bunker built for exactly that moment. Shadow walked to the front window and watched the snow begin to fall harder. Ethan stood beside him. Oh, looks like Whitaker knew something we didn't, he said. Outside, the mountains disappeared slowly behind thickening clouds. The storm had begun. The wind came first. It rolled down from the Rocky Mountains like something alive, pushing through the valley with a low, rising howl that rattled the windows of Iron Mesa Diner. Ethan Walker stood near the front window, watching the snow build across the parking lot. At first it had fallen gently. Now it moved sideways. Sheets of white slashed across the road, erasing the highway in minutes. Shadow sat beside him, ears forward, eyes locked on the storm outside. The dog's body had shifted into something Ethan recognized well. Alert, working, a soldier on watch. Ethan glanced at the old wall clock above the counter. 7:12 p.m. The storm had only been building for an hour, but he turned back toward the kitchen. Guess we should get the bunker ready. Shadow followed immediately. The hatch beneath the kitchen floor groaned as Ethan pulled it open again. Cold air rushed upward from the underground room. Ethan climbed down first, switching on the generator panel he had noticed earlier. A moment later, the low rumble of the backup generator filled the bunker. Soft electric lights flickered on across the shelves. The underground room came alive. Shadow walked the perimeter carefully, sniffing every corner again. Ethan checked the water tanks. Still full. Food supplies stacked neatly. Medical kits organized along the far wall. Whitaker hadn't built this place halfway. He had built it like a man preparing for war. Ethan nodded slowly. This'll work. Above them, yet the diner's door suddenly banged against the wall. Ethan froze. Shadow's head snapped upward. Voices. Ethan climbed the stairs quickly. The wind roared through the open doorway. Two figures stumbled inside, dragging heavy coats covered in snow. Frank Dalton slammed the door shut behind them. Snow spilled across the floor. Storm hit faster than expected, Frank muttered, breathing hard. Behind him stood Maria Alvarez, clutching a small supply bag. You weren't kidding about that bunker, she said. Ethan nodded. You heard about it already? Sheriff Reed called, Frank replied. He glanced toward the kitchen. Power's already out across half the county. As if on cue, the lights in the diner flickered once, then went dark. Only Ethan's flashlight remained. Maria crossed her arms tightly. How bad is this going to get? Ethan looked toward the kitchen hatch. Pretty bad. Frank stepped forward. You ready to open that bunker? Ethan nodded once. Let's move. Within minutes, they had moved into the underground shelter. Frank stared around in amazement. Good Lord, he whispered. This is bigger than I imagined. Maria walked along the shelves slowly. All these supplies. Whitaker built it, Ethan said. Frank nodded. That sounds like Sam. The wind howled louder above them. Snow slammed against the diner roof like handfuls of gravel. Then came another sound, a vehicle horn. Ethan looked up the stairs. Shadow was already moving. The dog sprinted up toward the diner entrance. Ethan followed. The moment he opened the door, the storm hit him like a wall. The snow blasted across the parking lot in blinding sheets. Through the white haze, Ethan could barely see the road. Then he saw movement. 2 figures struggling through the snow. A man carrying a child. Ethan ran forward. "Over here!" The man staggered toward him, nearly collapsing as they reached the doorway. The boy in his arms looked barely conscious. "We lost power. House heater died," the man gasped. "Sheriff said, diner." Ethan helped them inside. "Get downstairs." Within 15 minutes, more people arrived. Word had spread quickly. A pickup truck skidded into the lot. 3 elderly neighbors stumbled through the snow. A young couple arrived on foot. Another family appeared, their coats covered in ice. Each time the door opened, the storm tried to force its way inside. Shadow stood near the entrance, while barking sharply whenever someone approached through the blizzard, guiding them, leading them to safety. By 9 p.m., more than 20 people had gathered in the bunker. The generator hummed steadily. Maria began organizing food. Frank checked the heater system. Children huddled beneath blankets. The underground room filled with quiet voices and nervous breathing. Ethan stood near the entrance ladder, watching everyone settle. For the first time, the bunker was doing exactly what Whitaker had built it for: saving lives. Shadow suddenly stiffened. The dog moved toward the stairs again. Ethan followed. The wind outside had grown even stronger. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Then Shadow barked sharply. Ethan squinted into the storm. Something moved in the snow, a small shape, running blindly. Ethan rushed forward. A boy, no older than 10, stumbled across the parking lot. Before Ethan could reach him, the child slipped and vanished beneath the snow. Shadow bolted forward. The German shepherd dove into the snowdrift and began digging furiously. Ethan reached them seconds later. The boy's coat had snagged on buried ice. Shadow gripped the back of the jacket gently and pulled. Together, they dragged the child free. The boy gasped weakly. "Dad!" Ethan scooped him up and ran for the diner. Inside, the bunker door closed again. People gathered around the boy as Maria wrapped him in blankets. Shadow limped slightly as he returned downstairs. Ethan noticed immediately. The dog's front leg bled from a cut hidden beneath the fur. Ethan crouched beside him. "You all right, soldier?" Shadow leaned against him, tail wagging faintly, while Ethan cleaned the wound with a medical kit. The bunker grew quiet again. 40 people now filled the underground room. Children sleeping, adults whispering. Snow pounded the roof above them like thunder. Frank sat beside Ethan. "You realize something?" he said quietly. "What?" Frank nodded toward the bunker ceiling. "If this place hadn't been here tonight, Pine Hollow would have lost people." Ethan looked around the room, at the families, at the frightened children, at Shadow lying beside him, exhausted but watchful. Above them, the storm continued to rage, but beneath Iron Mesa Diner, the bunker held steady. For the first time in 20 years, it was full. The bunker beneath Iron Mesa Diner hummed with quiet life. The generator's steady rumble echoed softly through the concrete walls, blending with the sound of people breathing, whispering, and shifting beneath borrowed blankets. 40 people, families, neighbors, children, all gathered in the underground shelter that Samuel Whitaker had built decades earlier. The storm outside had erased the world beyond the diner. Snow hammered against the roof above them like distant thunder. Ethan Walker sat against the metal wall near the entrance ladder, watching the room carefully. Years in the military had trained him to do that. Watch, count, assess. Frank Dalton sat nearby, slowly sipping coffee Maria had warmed over a portable burner. "Never thought I'd see this bunker full," Frank said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Neither did Whitaker, probably." Maria moved through the room, checking on people the way a mother checks on sleeping children. The young boy Shadow had helped rescue earlier now slept under 2 thick blankets, his breathing steady again. Across the room, Sheriff Mason Reed spoke quietly with several town residents. The sheriff looked tired but calm, like a man who had seen enough storms to know panic never helped. Shadow lay beside Ethan. The dog's injured leg had been wrapped carefully with gauze from the bunker's medical supplies. Despite the bandage, Shadow's ears remained alert. The German shepherd lifted his head every time the wind howled louder above them, still guarding, still working. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ear gently. "You did good tonight." Shadow's tail moved once. Then suddenly the dog's ears snapped upright. A low growl formed in his chest. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" Shadow stood, when he stared toward the bunker stairs. Then he barked once, sharp, urgent. The room fell silent. Sheriff Reed looked up. "What's wrong?" Ethan climbed halfway up the ladder and pushed open the hatch. The wind roared instantly. Snow blasted through the doorway, stinging his face. At first, he saw nothing. Just white. Endless, swirling white. Then a shape appeared in the storm. Headlights. A vehicle buried almost completely in drifting snow along the road. Ethan squinted. The vehicle's hazard lights blinked faintly beneath the ice. He recognized the shape. Black SUV. Victoria Whitaker. Ethan felt a cold knot form in his chest. Sheriff Reed climbed up beside him. "You see that?" Ethan nodded. "That's her car." Reed cursed under his breath. "How far?" "Maybe 3 miles from here," Ethan said. While the sheriff studied the storm, the wind screamed across the valley. Visibility had dropped to nearly zero. "Anyone inside that car won't last long," Reed said. Ethan knew that. Hypothermia could kill in less than an hour in temperatures like this. Frank appeared at the bottom of the ladder. "What's going on?" Ethan looked back down. "Victoria Whitaker's car is stuck out there." Frank frowned. "That woman trying to take your diner?" Ethan didn't answer right away. The bunker behind him was warm, safe. People inside depended on him. But somewhere out there in the blizzard, someone was freezing. Shadow barked again. The dog stood at the base of the ladder, staring at Ethan with intense focus. Ethan understood that look. Shadow had seen something, maybe smelled something, maybe heard something through the storm. And either way, the dog was ready to move. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. War had taught him something simple. You don't leave people behind. He looked at Sheriff Reed. "I'm going." Reed grabbed his arm. "You step outside in that storm and you might not make it back." Ethan nodded. "I know." Frank stepped forward. "You don't owe that woman anything." Ethan looked down at Shadow. The dog stood ready, body tense with purpose. "No," Ethan said quietly. "But leaving someone out there to die, that's not who I am." Sheriff Reed sighed. "Then I'm coming with you." Ethan shook his head. "No." He looked toward the bunker. "Those people down there need someone in charge." Reed hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Take the emergency rope from the supply shelf," he said. "And keep one end tied to the diner post." Frank handed Ethan a heavy winter jacket. "You better come back with that dog," he muttered. Ethan zipped the coat tightly and wrapped a scarf across his face. Shadow stood beside him, already ready. The rope was tied securely around Ethan's waist. The other end was anchored to the diner's steel porch rail. Ethan opened the door. The storm hit him like a wall of ice. Wind screamed across the valley. Snow blinded everything beyond a few feet. "Stay close!" Sheriff Reed shouted. Ethan stepped into the storm. Shadow ran beside him immediately, nose low to the ground. The rope stretched behind them like a lifeline disappearing into the white darkness. Step by step they pushed forward. The wind fought every movement. Snow piled around their boots. Shadow moved faster. Yet the dog followed something invisible in the storm. Scent. Instinct. Training. After several minutes, Shadow barked. Ethan squinted through the snow. The dark shape of the SUV appeared, half buried, ice covering the windshield. Ethan pulled the door handle. Frozen. Shadow barked again and pawed at the driver's side window. Ethan wiped snow from the glass. Inside, Victoria Whitaker slumped against the steering wheel, her skin pale, barely moving. Ethan smashed the window with the emergency hammer from his pack. Glass shattered outward. He unlocked the door and pulled her out carefully. Her body was freezing, barely conscious. Shadow barked again, circling anxiously. Ethan lifted her onto his shoulder. "All right," he muttered. "Let's go home." The rope tugged against his waist, guiding them back through the storm, step by step. The wind screamed, snow blinded everything, but Shadow ran ahead confidently, leading them. When the diner's lights finally appeared through the storm, Ethan nearly collapsed with relief. Sheriff Reed and Frank rushed outside. Together they carried Victoria inside. Moments later they were back in the bunker. Maria wrapped Victoria in blankets, hot water bottles pressed against her sides. Slowly, painfully, color returned to her face. Ethan sank against the wall beside Shadow, exhaustion finally catching him. The room remained quiet. People watched silently, because everyone in that bunker knew something. The man they had doubted had just risked his life to save the woman trying to take his home. And somewhere deep inside that storm-filled night, something in Pine Hollow had begun to change. While the bunker remained quiet, except for the steady hum of the generator and the distant roar of the storm above. Snow hammered the roof of Iron Mesa Diner like waves crashing against a ship. The sound echoed through the concrete ceiling, reminding everyone that the world outside had turned wild and unforgiving. But underground, warmth held. 40 people sat or slept across the bunker, wrapped in blankets and coats. Some leaned against the walls, others rested on supply crates or folding cots pulled from storage. Exhaustion had finally settled over the room. Ethan Walker sat near the metal desk where Whitaker's journal rested. His shoulders ached from the storm and from carrying Victoria through the blizzard. Shadow lay beside him. The German shepherd's injured leg was stretched carefully across a folded blanket, the bandage clean but slightly stained. Even while resting, Shadow's ears twitched at every new sound. Still on watch. Ethan leaned back against the wall. For a moment, the quiet felt almost peaceful. Then Maria's voice broke the silence. "She's waking up." Several people turned. Victoria Whitaker lay on a narrow cot near the heater vent. Blankets surrounded her, and a warm lamp cast a soft glow over her pale face. Her eyes fluttered slowly. She blinked at the unfamiliar ceiling. Then she tried to sit up. Maria gently pressed her shoulder. "Easy now," she said. "You nearly froze out there." Victoria looked around the bunker in confusion. The shelves, the people, the generator humming in the corner. Then her eyes found Ethan. Recognition slowly returned. "You?" she whispered. Ethan stood and walked over. Yeah," he said quietly. Victoria swallowed. "The storm." "You were 3 miles out," Ethan replied. "Your engine died." Her eyes moved toward Shadow. The German shepherd had lifted his head. Victoria stared at the bandage on the dog's leg. "That dog pulled a kid out of a snowdrift earlier tonight," Ethan said. "He's had a busy shift." Victoria looked around the bunker again. Frank Dalton stood nearby with his arms crossed. Maria poured a cup of warm broth. Sheriff Reed watched from the far wall. Dozens of townspeople filled the room. People she had never met. People who would have been trapped in their freezing homes if the diner hadn't opened its doors. Her voice came out softer this time. "What is this place?" Ethan glanced toward the metal desk. Your grandfather's project. Victoria frowned. "Oh, my grandfather didn't build a bunker." Frank chuckled quietly. "Sam Whitaker built plenty of things he didn't tell folks about." Ethan picked up the leather journal from the desk. "I think you should see something." Victoria sat up slowly as he handed it to her. The leather cover felt heavy in her hands. Old. Worn. She opened the first page. The neat handwriting stared back at her. Samuel Whitaker. Her grandfather's name. Page after page filled with notes, construction diagrams, supply lists, maintenance records. Victoria flipped through the journal slowly. The deeper she read, the quieter she became. Ethan watched her carefully. At last she stopped at a folded envelope tucked between two pages. Her name was written across the front. Victoria. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The letter inside had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained steady. She read silently, then aloud. Victoria, if you are reading this, it means the diner has found someone new to watch over it. Her voice softened as she continued. I built this place not for profit, and not for inheritance. I built it for people who might one day need shelter when the world turns cold. The bunker fell silent. Victoria's eyes moved across the page. This diner belongs to the one who protects it when the time comes, not to the one who simply claims it by name. Her voice faltered. Ethan looked away, giving her space. Victoria continued. If someone stands here in the storm and opens the door for others, then they are the rightful guardian of Iron Mesa. Her hands lowered slowly. For a moment she said nothing. The bunker remained quiet. Frank cleared his throat softly. Sounds like Sam. Victoria looked at Ethan. For the first time since arriving, the anger in her expression was gone. Instead, there was something else. Understanding. You saved people tonight, she said. Ethan shrugged slightly. That bunker did most of the work. Victoria shook her head. No. Her eyes moved around the room. To open the door, someone had to decide to do that. She looked down at the letter again. My grandfather always believed the right person would find this place. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. Well, I found it by accident. Victoria gave a faint smile. Maybe that's how these things work. Shadow shifted beside Ethan, tail tapping lightly against the floor. Sheriff Reed stepped forward. So what happens now? Victoria folded the letter carefully. She looked around the bunker one more time, at the people sleeping, at the shelves of supplies her grandfather had prepared, at the man sitting beside the dog who had carried her through a blizzard. Her voice was calm. I'm withdrawing the lawsuit. Frank blinked. Just like that? Victoria nodded. This place doesn't belong to me. She looked directly at Ethan. It belongs to the man who stood in the storm. Ethan didn't respond right away. The weight of the moment settled quietly across the bunker. Above them, the storm still raged. But something had changed. Not just for the diner, for Pine Hollow, and for the man who had once believed he had nowhere left to go. Shadow rested his head gently on Ethan's boot. And for the first time since the war, Ethan Walker felt something he hadn't felt in years. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had found where he was meant to stand. The bunker remained quiet for a while after Victoria finished reading the letter. No one rushed to speak. No one felt the need to. Some moments were too heavy for words. The wind continued to roar above the diner, shaking the roof with violent gusts that made the ceiling groan. Snow pounded against the building like handfuls of gravel thrown from the sky. But underground, warmth held steady. The generator hummed. The lights glowed softly. The people of Pine Hollow slowly began to settle again. Children fell asleep first, then the older folks. One by one, the quiet breathing of the town filled the bunker. Ethan sat near the stair ladder, watching the room like he had been trained to do for years. Old habits never left. Shadow lay beside him, chin resting on Ethan's boot. The dog's eyes closed briefly, but every few minutes, one ear lifted again, still listening, still guarding. Across the bunker, Victoria Whitaker sat wrapped in blankets near the metal desk. The letter from her grandfather rested in her hands. She read it again slowly. Each line seemed to land differently now, not like an inheritance, more like instructions. Frank Dalton eventually broke the silence. "Well," he muttered, stretching his stiff legs, "Sam Whitaker always did have a flair for surprises." Maria chuckled softly. That old Marine probably planned this whole thing. Sheriff Reed leaned back against the concrete wall. Maybe he just trusted the right person would show up when the time came. His eyes shifted briefly toward Ethan, but Ethan pretended not to notice. Outside, the storm grew even louder. The bunker lights flickered for a moment, then steadied again. Frank frowned. "Generator holding up?" Ethan stood. "I'll check." He walked across the bunker to the generator unit and knelt beside it. The machine vibrated steadily beneath his hand. Fuel level still strong, temperature stable. Whitaker had chosen good equipment. Frank stepped beside him. "You handled yourself pretty well out there tonight," the old mechanic said. Ethan shrugged. "Just followed the rope." Frank shook his head. "No." He looked toward Shadow. "That dog followed something stronger than rope." Ethan glanced at Shadow. The German shepherd had lifted his head again, eyes watching the bunker entrance. "You two been together long?" Frank asked. "Since Afghanistan." Frank nodded slowly. "My brother had a K9 partner over there." Ethan said nothing. Frank understood. Some memories stayed locked away. After a moment, the mechanic gave Ethan a small nod and walked back toward the others. Hours passed. The storm never slowed. Midnight came and went. Snow piled deeper across the valley. Drifts climbed halfway up the diner windows above them. The temperature outside had dropped well below zero. Sheriff Reed checked his radio again. Still nothing but static. "No power across the county," he said quietly. Maria passed out warm broth from a large metal pot. Even Victoria helped distribute cups. It was the first time Ethan had seen her smile. Small, but real. At around 3 a.m, the bunker lights flickered again. This time longer. Everyone looked up, and Frank frowned. That's not good. Ethan moved quickly back to the generator. The machine sputtered once, then caught again. But the sound had changed slightly. Not failing, straining. Ethan checked the fuel line. Snowmelt water had begun freezing inside the outer pipe. Frank crouched beside him. "Can you fix it?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "But I need to clear the intake." Frank glanced toward the ladder. "That means going outside." Ethan nodded. Sheriff Reed stood. "I'll go." Ethan shook his head. "You've got people here who need you." Frank crossed his arms. "I'm not letting you freeze to death out there either." Shadow stood suddenly. The dog walked to the ladder and waited. Ethan sighed. "Looks like he already volunteered." Maria stepped forward. "Be careful." Victoria looked at Ethan. Don't die fixing a generator," she said softly. Ethan pulled on his coat again. "I'll try not to." He opened the hatch. The wind exploded into the diner like a living thing. Snow blasted across the floor instantly. Ethan stepped outside. The world had disappeared. Everything was white. The diner roof groaned under the weight of snow. Shadow stayed tight beside him as they moved toward the generator intake vent along the building wall. The pipe was half buried beneath ice. Ethan grabbed the shovel leaning near the door and began digging. The wind fought every movement. Snow stung his face, his fingers quickly numbed. Shadow barked sharply whenever Ethan slowed. "Yeah," Ethan muttered through the scarf. "I hear you." After several minutes of digging, he reached the intake pipe. Ice clogged the vent opening. He hammered at it with the shovel handle until the blockage broke free. The wind immediately sucked the snow away from the pipe. Inside the diner, the generator's rumble grew stronger. Ethan leaned against the wall briefly. The cold had seeped deep into his bones. Shadow nudged him hard. The dog's eyes were intense. "Move." Ethan pushed himself upright. "All right." They stumbled back through the door. Frank slammed it shut behind them. The bunker lights steadied. The generator sound returned to its strong, even rhythm. Frank grinned. "Looks like you fixed it." Ethan peeled snow from his jacket. "Whitaker built good equipment." Sheriff Reed chuckled. "And Pine Hollow found itself a good mechanic." Ethan sat back down beside Shadow. The dog leaned against him, exhausted but satisfied. Above them, the storm finally began to fade. The wind softened slightly. The pounding snow turned into drifting flakes. Slowly, very slowly. Morning began to creep toward the mountains. And deep beneath Iron Mesa Diner, the people of Pine Hollow waited for the light to return. At first, it was only a faint change in the air. The storm's roar softened. The violent shaking of the diner roof faded into long stretches of quiet. Then the bunker lights flickered once as the wind above slowed. Sheriff Mason Reed climbed the ladder first. He pushed open the hatch carefully. Cold air spilled down the stairwell, but the wild force of the blizzard had faded. "Looks like it's passing," he called down. Ethan Walker followed him up. Shadow came right behind, moving more slowly now because of the bandaged leg, but the diner interior looked almost unreal in the pale morning light. Snow had piled halfway up the windows. The parking lot had disappeared beneath deep white drifts, but the sky above the valley was clearing. Thin blue patches opened between the clouds. Ethan walked to the front door and pushed it open. The cold air was sharp and clean. Outside, Pine Hollow looked transformed. The storm had buried everything. Snow blanketed the road, the trees, and the distant fields. The mountains shone white in the morning sun. Sheriff Reed stepped out beside him. "Well," the sheriff said, looking across the valley, "we made it." Behind them, people began climbing up from the bunker one by one. Frank Dalton stepped into the diner and whistled softly. "That's a lot of snow." Maria Alvarez followed, wrapping her coat tighter. "But everyone's alive," she said. That mattered more than anything. Children ran to the windows, staring at the frozen landscape with wide eyes. Adults stretched stiff limbs after a long night underground. Victoria Whitaker climbed the ladder last. She paused at the top step, looking around the diner slowly. The place looked very different now. Footprints covered the dusty floor. The tables had been pushed aside to make room for supplies. People filled the room with voices and movement. The diner that had once been abandoned now felt alive again. She walked toward the front door where Ethan stood. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victoria looked out at the valley. "My grandfather always said storms reveal the truth about people," she said quietly. Ethan shrugged slightly. "Oh, guess he was right." Frank stepped outside with a shovel. "Well," he announced, "if we want to get these folks home, we've got some digging to do." Soon the parking lot filled with activity. Several men from town began clearing paths through the deep snow. Sheriff Reed organized people into groups. Maria handed out hot coffee from a large pot she had reheated inside the diner. Laughter slowly replaced the tension from the night before. Even the children helped by carrying small buckets of snow away from the entrance. Shadow limped outside and sat near the doorway, watching everything carefully. Ethan knelt beside him. "You earned some rest." Shadow leaned against him gently. Victoria approached, holding the folded letter. "I've been thinking about what my grandfather wrote," she said. Ethan stood. "Huh, so have I." Victoria took a slow breath. "The lawsuit is finished," she said. "I'll contact my lawyers today and withdraw it officially." Frank overheard from across the lot. "About time," he called out with a grin. Victoria ignored the comment. Instead, she looked around the diner again. "I'd like to help fix the place," she said. Ethan blinked. "You don't have to." "I know." Her voice was calm. "But the diner shouldn't just survive a storm." She looked at the building with new understanding. "It should live again." Ethan thought about that. About the bunker. About the people who had survived the night beneath this roof. About the old photograph of Samuel Whitaker smiling outside this very building decades earlier. "Yeah," Ethan said finally. "I think that's what Whitaker wanted." Sheriff Reed walked over, was brushing snow from his coat. "County plows should reach the road by afternoon," he said. He looked toward Ethan. "You planning to stay in Pine Hollow?" Ethan glanced toward the diner. The faded Iron Mesa sign still hung crooked above the door. Snow clung to the old chrome trim. But the building didn't look abandoned anymore. It looked like a place waiting to start again. Shadow barked once. Ethan smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I think we're staying." Victoria folded the letter carefully. Then she handed it to Ethan. "My grandfather wrote that for the person who protected this place," she said. "That wasn't me." Ethan took the letter slowly. Snow sparkled across the valley as the sun climbed higher above the mountains. People continued clearing paths through the drifts. The storm had nearly buried Pine Hollow. Oh, but it had also revealed something the town hadn't seen in a long time. Community, courage, and the quiet strength of a man who had arrived with nothing but a dog and $5. Sheriff Reed looked at the diner thoughtfully. "Funny thing about storms," he said. "What's that?" Frank asked. "They show you which buildings are strong enough to stand." He nodded toward Iron Mesa Diner. "Looks like this one passed the test." Shadow wagged his tail slowly as he watched the town come back to life. And beside him, Ethan Walker stood in the bright winter sunlight. For the first time in many years, he wasn't wondering where the road would take him next, because the road had finally led him home. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Pine Hollow. The snow from the great storm remained piled along the valley for weeks. Oh, but the roads eventually cleared, the power returned, and life resumed its quiet rhythm beneath the Rocky Mountains. But something in the town had changed. People talked about that night. They talked about the storm, about the bunker beneath Iron Mesa Diner, about the man and the German shepherd who had opened the doors when the valley froze. Word traveled. Truckers passing through Pine Hollow began stopping again, curious about the old roadside diner that had somehow come back to life. 6 months later, the building looked different. The cracked parking lot had been cleared and leveled. Frank Dalton and several volunteers from town had repaired the old roof and reinforced the windows. The faded neon sign had been restored. Now, when the sun set over the mountains, the bright red letters glowed once more above the highway. Iron Mesa Diner. Inside, the transformation was even greater. The red vinyl booths had been repaired and polished. The chrome counter gleamed under warm lights. The smell of fresh coffee and grilled bacon filled the air from sunrise until late afternoon. Maria Alvarez ran the kitchen most mornings. Frank handled maintenance and equipment. Sheriff Reed stopped by every day around noon for a cup of coffee and whatever special Maria decided to cook. The diner had become something more than just a restaurant again. It had become a gathering place, a refuge, just like Samuel Whitaker had imagined decades earlier. Ethan Walker stood behind the counter one quiet afternoon, wiping down a stack of coffee mugs. Shadow lay beneath the counter at his feet, resting comfortably. The scar on the dog's injured leg had healed well, but only a faint line of fur missing remained as a reminder of the storm. Shadow had become something of a local celebrity. Children from Pine Hollow often stopped by just to sit beside him. Truckers traveling through the valley took photos with the big German shepherd who had saved people during the blizzard. Shadow tolerated the attention with quiet dignity, but he never strayed far from Ethan. Some habits never changed. Victoria Whitaker entered through the front door, brushing snowflakes from her coat. Even in spring, the mountains still sent cold winds through the valley. "You're getting busier," she said, looking around the diner. Several customers sat at the booths. 2 truck drivers laughed loudly near the window. A group of local ranchers shared a table near the counter. Ethan smiled. Not bad for a $5 investment." Victoria walked toward the counter. She had changed too. The sharp business confidence she had carried on that first day had softened into something steadier, something closer to belonging. She set a folder down on the counter. "I finalized the foundation paperwork," she said. Ethan opened it. Iron Mesa Veterans Relief Fund, a small charity created to support struggling veterans across the region. Victoria leaned against the counter. "My grandfather believed this diner should help people," she said. "I figured we might as well keep that promise." Ethan looked around the diner, at the laughter, at the smell of fresh food, at the quiet sense of safety that filled the room. "You're doing a good thing," he said. Victoria smiled faintly. "Actually," she replied. "Oh, you started it." Shadow lifted his head slightly as the door opened again. A young couple entered, carrying a small child wrapped in a bright winter coat. They looked around uncertainly. Maria called from the kitchen. "Table by the window is open." The family smiled and walked over. Ethan watched them settle in. Another traveler finding warmth along the highway. Another story passing through the diner. Victoria stepped toward the front window. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected across the snow-covered mountains. The valley looked peaceful, strong, alive. She glanced back toward Ethan. "My grandfather would have liked this," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I think he would." He reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small wooden plaque Frank had made the week before. It hung beside the front entrance now. The carved letters read, "Iron Mesa Diner, established 1979, reopened by Ethan Walker and Shadow stood and stretched lazily. Then he walked to the front door and sat near the entrance, watching the road, just like he had done on that stormy night. Outside, the highway curved gently through the valley, disappearing into the distant mountains. New travelers would come. New storms would pass. But Iron Mesa Diner would remain, a place where doors stayed open, a place where people found warmth when the world turned cold. And beside the door, always watching the road, sat a German shepherd who had helped guide a broken veteran home. The neon sign flickered on as evening settled across Pine Hollow. And for the first time in 20 years, the lights of Iron Mesa Diner shone brightly across the valley once again. But if this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you. You don't have to write a long comment. Just type a simple 1 in the comments if you believe a loyal dog can change a person's life. Or type 0 if you think Ethan would never have made it through that storm without Shadow. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world tonight, tell us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoy stories about veterans, loyal dogs, and the kind of courage that shows up when the world turns cold, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. There are many more waiting to be told, and somewhere out there tonight, another road is leading someone home.